Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Libertarian Podcast, a LPNU Roundtable Podcast. I am your host, Jason Irizarry. So, for any confusion, Mata Alpha is what I used to go by, but this is another podcast episode for another day. I am your host. I am also the treasurer for the Libertarian Party of Maine and also your Waldo County rep. We have returning guest Dane, but we have a bunch of fresh faces for this podcast episode. So we'll go ahead and get some introductions, and we'll start with you, Dane, and then we can work our way around.
Yep, Dane Courtois. You guys all know me. I am the chair of the Libertarian Party of Maine.
Joe.
Joe Weeks. I'm the Southern Region Rep for the Libertarian Party of Maine.
And we're really happy to have Chuck and get some cross-pollination going in this episode. So, Chuck, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Chuck Ellis. I'm the chair of the Cumberland County Republicans, the host of the Muddy Waters podcast, and the treasurer for the Common Sense for Maine PAC, amongst other things.
Awesome. And last but not least, Tim.
Yep, Tim, chair of the, I believe. I've only been with you guys a few months now.
And we are very happy to have you. So, with the introductions out of the way, we wanted to have this episode because we had a very interesting conversation inside of like the back channel libertarian super secret chat that we have going on. And it was actually a really interesting conversation where we got into a discussion about basically terminology that's used sometimes in political talk between leftists and conservatives and libertarians, and how sometimes like the type of verbiage we use can sometimes be misconstrued or abused by certain people to mean different things. So I think what we were talking about primarily was the idea of social contract, like or social contract theory. So for those who are not aware, the idea of a social contract is a contract that is made between individuals that is not necessarily present in a documentation, meaning that me and Chuck don't sit down at a table, have like a lawyer get involved, write a contract up, we both sign and agree to the principles. It is a observation of how people interact with one another, and there are certain limits that are imposed, rights that are imposed, that society tends to work on, even if they don't explicitly have a conversation and agree to it. So sometimes people will go ahead and say that the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution and the structure are social contracts, in the sense that I am a very big Second Amendment fan. I'm sure most of the guys here are too. But you can't physically go into a building, like even if you go into Philadelphia and grab the Constitution or Declaration of Independence and tear it up, it doesn't change the fact that that right exists, because it's a right that exists in the mind and that is instituted throughout society. So that's basic social contract theory. The reason why I think it got really interesting, that conversation, is that especially within some libertarian and conservative circles, because a lot of the left tend to use social contract theory to try to like excuse their behavior, they will, us on the right side of the spectrum, will tend to like poo-poo the term, or we think that it's a dirty term to use. But my posit is that if we're truly going to be effective in modern politics, we have to be able to acknowledge what the term actually means, and then be able to like slap away leftists when they use it inappropriately, and then reinforce what it actually means. So with that in mind, guys, social contract theory, is this just purely a leftist term that we need to go ahead and throw into the gutter? Or is this something that we actually should be embracing within libertarian thought and even conservative thought, Chuck? Who wants to give their take?
I mean, I'm happy to talk. I mean, I think the social contract, another way to think about it is just that we're all here not violating the law because we agree that the system that exists here in the state in the country of the United States of America is a good one, and it like our belief, the strength of our belief in the system, and this process is a big part of what keeps us falling in line with the process. And I think one of the challenges that I see with the way that the left behaves is kind of you were indicating, is that they say, well, we have the social contract there and we're following technically the rules of the social contract. Therefore, we can do these types of things that, go to places where they're trying to follow the rules of the system in a sense, but they're also violating it where they're trying to take away, for instance, our right to have guns. And they're expecting that we should just be okay with that. And there's it kind of, I think that the problem with that is that in order for us to continue this system to continue to work, we have to continue to believe it. And the further they go, the more we are likely to not believe and trust the system, trust the institutions, for instance. I could talk longer, but I don't want to take up too much. But I was having a conversation with somebody who works for a local media station, and he was talking about he has this, and he's more on the left. Technically, I think he says he's unenrolled or whatever, but he's on the left. And he was saying one of his concerns is that people aren't believing in the institutions, and we're not believing in the institutions, and that's a serious problem. That's a breakdown in the social contract that we have, because people are stopping believing that the system is capable of working, and when they believe that the system is not working, that leaves us in a situation where we're much more likely to throw off the social contract and kind of devolve into anarchy or civil war. So it is incredibly dangerous, but why don't we trust the institutions? Because they're not telling us the truth. So that's the problem. The problem isn't that we don't trust the institutions. The problem is that the institutions don't deserve our trust. Anyway, I've talked too much. I'll shut up.
No. I think that was spot on. But you did use a term that I know Dane would that I caught immediately.
Yeah, easy on narco bashing.
Yeah, Dane is a resident anarchist in terms of like the libertarian view. Like someone like me, I would fall into, like, in terms of libertarian thought, I would fall into the minarchist view, where I do believe in a government. I think it should be small, but it should have very direct goals. Dane's full-on black flag anarchist, wants to go ahead and be a pirate on the seas. I'm just messing
I'm
around.
an ANCAP. I still believe in capitalism.
So Dane, go ahead and give us I'm honestly very curious to hear what your anarcho take is on this, because I do think that social contract theory is very, very apropos if you have certain views in terms of like government structure and what the actual role of government is and where its power comes from. As an anarchist, do you still think that like social contract theory is actually valid?
Yeah, I would probably qualify social contract theory in the same vein as like natural law, of like natural rights. Like, don't hurt others, don't take their shit, the normal non-aggression type perspective, and do unto others as you would have done unto you kind of deal, right? Like, and that's the agreement that you enter in with everyone else in every relationship you engage upon. Every relationship is an anarchist relationship, because no one is obligated to have a relationship with another person. And I think that can be extrapolated exponentially out to all relationships, whether it be with a government or a township or your neighbors or whatever it might be. So I take more of a natural law kind of perspective on that. As far as like the structure is, I think, natural to just being a human being.
Yeah, I like that you use social, like the idea of natural law. I think that actually ties into a lot in terms of like what the actual founders of classical liberalism actually thought when it came to the idea of social contract. Like, for example, a lot of times Adam Smith is, I would try to be generous, and is misread. But like Adam Smith clearly states that for a market to exist, it needs to exist within a moral community with shared social norms and institutions that have a certain amount of trust with the people that are involved in that society. Locke is very famous for saying that atheists cannot take place in a free market, because since they have no moral authority to pull on, they can never make promises that should be trusted. So like the idea of social contract goes back to like the foundational thoughts of liberalism, not just on the English side, which is like your Adam Smith and your Locke's. And although I despise Rousseau with a passion, because I think that his overall viewpoint eventually led to like progressivism and communism, but I think that he also shared this view of that there is a contract that is made between individuals who choose to associate within a community. I think that's the key, is that, to your point, people obviously have a right to not have to associate with one another. Like as libertarians, we believe that. Even as conservatives, they'll believe that you're not forced to associate with anybody you don't want to associate with. But there is a certain level of association that takes place when you live in any kind of large community, which a country definitely is. When you have 300 million people and over 600 million guns, I hope that your social contract is strong enough so you don't all just kill each other. So like there's a certain level of like continuity that has to exist for you to be able to be more than two people on 100 acres on an island away from everybody else. Like if you're going to exist around other people, there is a social norm contract that is signed. Whether you choose to sign it or not doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, all these contracts, all they are is just force. Like we talked about previously, like there is no place where the Constitution, like if you tear it now, oh my God, all the rights are gone. The other day's idea, like, hey, if you don't do this thing, that's fine. You can violate whatever you want, but someone with a gun is going to stop you. So as long as you are aware of that consequence, whether you want to opt in or not opt in, at the end of the day, you break a law, whether you believe in laws or not, someone with a badge and a gun is going to come and they're probably going to put you in some very metal circular things that go around your wrist, and your freedom will be stripped from you. And most of society is not going to line up outside your prison cell to break you out, because how dare they? You didn't sign that contract. We're all going to go about our days, and we understand that this is part of living in a society. Like, does that track to you guys, or is there some holes that I am missing that anybody thinks they want to call
No,
out?
generally.
Joe, go ahead. I
Well,
see you nodding a little bit. Let me see it.
well, no, I mean, I kind of gestured to say, not that I disagree per se, but there's a few things that some folks have already mentioned that I kind of would like to kind of question the distinction of. So there's just let me preface with my understanding of how social contract is generally used in the modern sense is in an obligatory sense, as in, if you've done well in society, you're wealthy, you're successful, etc., you will, from a certain perspective, are therefore obligated to do XYZ as determined by the people who decided you have that obligation. Whereas my understanding on the social contract side of things from an Adam Smith perspective is that you have a responsibility as somebody who is productive, done well, wealthy, whether your responsibility to your community is more what you decide to further contribute based on kind of what you've been able to derive from the community when it comes to that success, wealth, whatever it may be. So that distinction is what kind of separates left and right interpretation of the phrase social contract in my mind. Whereas on the left, quite often it's termed in a way of, Elon Musk is a trillionaire now, therefore he should end world hunger. As somebody who's not a trillionaire, that's what I've determined is his obligation. Whereas Elon Musk is, being responsible for himself and wielding the success that he's derived is instead, focusing on, making humanity a multiplanetary species. So there's a misalignment on the social contract, but to each group, it seems to satisfy the criteria. The less than, trillionaires have decided what he should do with that wealth, and he has made a different decision, and that's where the conflict comes in. I think to the extent that, in the Vegas framework, maybe they're both satisfying the social contract in trying to determine what's best for humanity as a greater whole, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I think the one thing that, so I agree with you in terms of like the differential between the leftist view and the more conservative or classical liberal view. But I do think that one thing that we on the right side of the spectrum coded do leave out is that although we do think that there's a separation of terms and we can't tell Elon Musk how to spend his trillions, what that also does not mean is that every person is like exempt from potential appropriation of anything. Like Locke would even say that. Like he said, for example, that appropriation is only just when enough and as good is left for others. So like Locke and Smith would say, for example, hey, if you have a factory and you're dropping poison accidentally or knowingly into the water, and because that the water supply is diminishing, and now you own most of the clean water, I don't care if it's on your property. You did not leave enough good and well off due to your own choices for everyone else. So we're going to come and take that fucking water, whether you like it or not. And that would be, from a classical liberal view, a proper violation of property rights and individuality. Because the idea being that you still owe something to if you're going to operate in a society, you owe the society enough so that way the society also has the ability to do as it so chooses. So like if your choices are restricting the ability for another person to make a choice, is that still a violation? I think that's where the gray area comes in. And like some of the NAP people will fight each other on, well, what is aggression? Like, is it aggression if I like knowingly like suck up all the water on the water table so that way you can't have access to it, but I can go ahead and like water all my almonds? Or is that not aggression? Like, where is that line? And that's where we end up getting into fights with each other and with leftists. Tim, I'm curious if you haven't chimed in yet, so I want to hear what you got to say.
Yeah. So, just I guess for Chuck's benefit too, because the main reason we're having this conversation is because, Jason and I were discussing this very topic in chat, and I took issue with some things he said. But I do have to preface everything I say with the fact that I'm not nearly as well read as you are, Jason. I hope to read a lot of this stuff in the future, but I haven't yet. So I have what I would consider like a normie's view of a lot of these things. But I do have a visceral negative reaction to this, even the phrasing of social contract. Even Locke's use of it, having read some about it, I'm very accepting of it. I don't think it's as extreme as I initially thought, but just using the word contract, I find very inappropriate, right? Because nowadays a contract means something more. It's terms written down and agreed to and signed. the social contract is not that. And you can see the problem that we're even having trouble deciding what it is. And it's typically whatever the speaker intends it to mean, right? And that's why too I was saying that it was like I found it to be a leftist term, because people usually use it to mean you owe taxes. You're obligated to pay taxes. I think a lot of us libertarians would take issue with that. I don't even agree to that, right? I don't even agree that I owe taxes. And, a lot of these examples that we talk about are very gray areas, like the data center thing. And I don't have a good answer for it. I don't think anyone really does. But, the point I made about the data center example was, well, who's responsible for everyone having water? Is it the data center? I don't know. I don't think so. If the state is supplying water like it typically does, as far as I know, they hold a lot of responsibility. How is it that they can allow a data center to suck up all the water so residents can't have it? I mean, you could, responsibility goes all around, I suppose. But I personally lay it at the feet of the utility company, the state operated utility company. But as a libertarian, I typically say, let the market take care of it. The price of water will rise. That will incentivize folks to come in and supply more water, hopefully. Maybe in practice it doesn't always work out, but that's the philosophy I tend to adhere to. I'll stop there for now.
No, I think you're spot on. I think you're 100% right, and I think that most people, even like conservatives listening to this, if there are any, would probably agree with a lot of what you said. I think, and I'm curious to get your idea, Chuck, on this. I think the trouble that we run into, because when you talk about like Republicans, like you have like the last 30 years, it's seen like a big change in what a Republican or a conservative is. Like it went from being like your war hawk, like Cheney, Bush Republicans. You had the Tea Party come in for a bit. You've got this semi-populist technocratic thing going on now with like Trump and some of the people like the J.D. Vance types who are, I think, populist in a lot of their verbiage, but at the same time have like a very close relationship with like people from Palantir and some other stuff that I think both conservatives and libertarians both agree, like, we got to keep an eye on them. I'm not saying that they're evil yet. We'll see, but like there's reason to be cautious. So like I think that there was a time where most conservatives and most libertarians would say, yeah, like the market's got this. Like government's inefficient. It usually makes things more complicated, more expensive. So like government should be out of it. I think the challenge that we run into is that like at the same time we say that, we do see that these large corporations come in and they try to fill the whole of government, and they do the same thing in terms of like the overall outcome. They just do it more efficiently. Like it costs them less money to take your freedoms away, but they still take your freedoms away. Like it takes them like less time to do it. They're way more efficient in oppressing other people. I use the word oppression loosely. I'm not trying to use the leftist term for oppression. I mean, in terms of like stripping others from their natural rights. They just do it a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and could do it a lot like more broadly. So I think that's a challenge where we get pushback from the left, where I hate giving credit to the left sometimes, because if you give them like an inch, they want to take 25,000 miles and like run you into the sun. But it does seem that they have a point in terms of, well, do we actually operate in a free market? And if we don't, then how can we say that the free market is the answer? So like, what's your opinion on that, Chuck?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't believe that we currently operate in a completely free market. Obviously, I think we live in a society where, and I don't think we were. I will say, too, I don't think that our founding fathers actually. And the exact details of the history of America, I'm not a complete expert in. So where like antitrust laws came into play, I'm not sure 100%. Like I'll be honest about that. So take that with a grain of salt. But like antitrust laws were built into our system because of the fact that corporations can oppress. Like the Constitution was written to ensure that the government could not oppress us, right? It was written to tell the government what it couldn't do to people, what rights it couldn't take away. And now we've gotten to a weird situation where the government has somehow taken away many of those rights, and people still talk about the Constitution, which I think we should, because it's a great Constitution. But it's been overridden by a lot of legislators in Washington over the years. But I also think it's in the spirit of what they were trying to do, which is protect people against being oppressed by large organizations, namely the government. But that's also where antitrust was supposed to come into play. Now, one of the challenges that I think we have in our current environment is that nobody seems to really care about antitrust. I mean, every now and then Elizabeth Warren will rail about it, but in all reality, nobody actually does anything, to stop these major corporations from buying up any of their potential eventual would-be competitors, which is why you've got, it's kind of funny. If you want to invest in the stock market, in buy large cap stock, you can look at these big portfolios that are being managed by people that are getting paid millions and billions of dollars to do it, and realize that 60% of their holdings are 10 stocks, that you could easily just own those 10 stocks because they have that much of a centralization of essentially not just the economy, but also power. That's the concern that I have with those major corporations. And again, the Republican Party has changed drastically, as you said, over the course of the last 30 years, but it hasn't changed in I think it's like, it doesn't seem that serious about this problem. Which is one of the concerns I have. I'm very in favor of a lot of the things, not everything, of the current administration, but this is one area that's a huge oversight that I think needs to be addressed, because it does, again, it harms the average person. I mean, I like to talk about Amazon sometimes, and Amazon gives us cheap stuff, and I'm sure everybody has bought something on Amazon in the last week or month or whatever. Because it's easy, it's convenient, it's inexpensive, and it's what I want, right? Delivered right to my door. The problem is the number of companies that have been eliminated, the number of good jobs, management level jobs, like high paying jobs that used to exist in a bunch of companies that now no longer exist, all so that I can get something that I definitely don't need to be delivered to my door tomorrow, that easily and conveniently and cheaply, and then we waste our money in other places. And so, like, this is a problem that has a ripple effect in our society, and it kind of exacerbates this situation in which these larger corporations continue to get larger, and they're largely also, with their power and influence that they have in DC, able to lobby to, I don't know, it seems like they're pretending to lobby against regulation, but in reality, I think they're lobbying for regulation so that it makes it difficult for anybody to get into their field. And so it's regulation that they can handle, but the small guys, can't. So it regulates the small guys out of business. I'm kind of a little bit unique in my conservative views, although the conservative movement itself, Republican movement, is actually very diverse. We have people that are strong libertarians, and then we have people that are probably still in the Bush Cheney era thinking. But I actually think that I'm fine regulating major corporations. And I think that the challenge is looking at, like, how do we define that? And that's what, like, I think is a huge challenge, but I think it is something that we can overcome if we actually had the opportunity to do it and say what we actually want. We want to regulate the big businesses to the point where businesses don't want to get that big, where they own too much of a percentage, I think, of whatever industry they're in. And I think that's the challenge there too, is that you have companies like, Apple or whoever, who, like, we're going to branch into all these other different categories now. So now we don't have too much of a capitalization in any one category, but we've branched into so many. And it sometimes feels like trying to think about solving that problem is a little bit like whack-a-mole. But I do think that there's some progress that we could make that would encourage more of our society to be driven by small businesses, rather than smaller companies and corporations, rather than these massive, gigantic organizations that ultimately, control the world, control our country in large part. So anyway, I could go on, but I don't know.
No, that was awesome. That was fantastic. And I think that actually leads to, like, a much bigger point. Like, when we talk about the current structure, we're talking about, like, the neoliberal order, the post-World War II consensus. Like, that's what we're talking about. I think the challenge we run into is, okay, is the post-war neoliberal order what the founding fathers had in mind for the country? And
Absolutely not.
not only that, but is that also what, like, the liberal found fathers, your Locke's, your Rousseau's, your Smiths, is that what they had in mind when they talked about markets and so on and so forth? I think the trap that we all run into sometimes, and is that because we do not, and I think rightfully so, because we know how dangerous the communist view of, like, centralizing the means of production and so on and so forth, like, since we know how dangerous and how historically, how murderous that system has
Deadly,
been,
yeah.
we tend to go anything even like a sliver close to that. I can't take the chance. But that puts us into a place now. And I think I'm curious to get like Dane and Joe, your view in this. Like, I think this is one that's really kind of maybe like give you a little bit of an itch. So, for example, the Elon Musk conversation, many on the left will go, there should be no trillionaires, which I think is asinine. Like, if you're able to accumulate that kind of money, then so be it. However, I think my critique would be, is it a good system when you can have a trillionaire? And this is the reason why I ask it. I looked up out of curiosity what the highest paid engineering position is at SpaceX. So the reason why Elon Musk just became a trillionaire is because the IPO for SpaceX went public. It is now the most valuable company in the existence of human existence, which is crazy to think about, but it basically is. So that's where most of his newfound wealth has come from, is the IPO for SpaceX. So the highest paid engineer at SpaceX makes somewhere between $400,000 to $500,000 per year, which is a fantastic salary. That is a job that Elon created, and God bless him for it, and the market should be thankful for it, so on and so forth. But when we talk about the evaluation of Elon Musk, like what his net worth is, what we're saying is that his production, what he's able to produce and contribute to society, has a certain monetary value in terms of worth attached to it of $1 trillion. At $500,000, that is equivalent to 2.5 million engineers. So here's my question to both of you. The United States as a whole, would it benefit more from 2.5 million new engineers or from 1 trillionaire? I think that's the actual argument. I think the left is, if I want to be charitable to the left, which I don't think they actually want to make this argument, if I want to be charitable and try to get them some grace, I think that if you want to be the most charitable, that's the argument that they're actually making is, well, we think that society as a whole would benefit from 2.5 million people at the level they can get paid $500,000 to be one of these engineers, and one guy who's, and let's be frank and honest, what Elon does is fantastic and amazing, but his superpower isn't that he's like with a torque wrench going ahead and fucking putting together the rocket. Is that he knows how to allocate resources. He knows, okay, if I take this and put it here, I'll get this ROI. If I take this and put this here, and I can organize these very intelligent people into these combinations, I will be able to go ahead and produce X, which is a gift. Not many people have it, which is why I don't think the leftist argument of take his money is, I think it's asinine, because he has a gift that you don't, so don't be jealous about it. At the same time, if you ask me, do I trade one Elon or 2.5 million engineers? I think you could probably convince me to easily give up an Elon and take 2.5 million engineers. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, Dane, and then Joe will get you chiming right after Dane.
I am going to take kind of a pussy ass response to that, and I think that they're both valuable. And honestly, but if I had to choose, I think I would still come down on the side of Elon, to be completely honest, for a couple reasons. First of all, what he's been able to do with X, I think, has unilaterally saved our freedom of speech and potentially our country. When he bought that platform, it was a really dark space for freedom of speech, and I think we've seen a lot of benefit from that being completely opened up. And to be able to measure the breadth and the impact of that, I think is asinine. There's no way you can. But I can certainly look at what it would be like in society right now if we didn't have that, and I don't want to fucking live there. I mean, like, I think you said 2.5 million of those engineers, was it?
So for clarification, so that $400,000 is for a lead engineer at SpaceX. If you go right now on like the SpaceX website and look up their careers, the highest paying positions are around that, and they usually are in charge of a team of about 10 to 15 engineers. Those engineers are usually have a master's level degree in like astrophysics, nuclear physics. So you're talking about very high functioning individuals. So those high functioning individuals are being paid at that consummate rate. So the market is dictating that for you to be a rocket scientist, you are worth $500,000 a year.
Right. I mean, I think there's a couple of holes in that as well, though. Like, that's first assuming that there even be a market for that level of people that are that smart, right? I think that if that were the case, honestly, if we're speaking frankly, that would flood the market, and that 2.5 million of people would not be making $500,000. They're making $100,000 because there wouldn't be that much need for that amount of that brain power. However, I mean, the reason why humanity has been able to flourish over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, specifically in the modern age as well, over tens of thousands of years, is because of our ability to specialize. You know, once agriculture was ubiquitous all over the world, we were able to get specialities in everything, right? And that's what has progressed humanity's innovation ever since. So there's also an argument there as far as like, is it better to have a lot of really smart people or just one that kind of knows how to, delineate down? I mean, again, I think both are valuable, but if I were to pick one over the other, I think I'd come down on Musk is more important.
Cool. But Joe, before you chime in, I just want to throw this in here as like not a counter, but just to give some more color, so that way if Joe wanted to keep dogpiling with all the good points that Dave made, I can give him something to think about. So one would be, and I think I acknowledge your argument, is that we say things like agriculture being ubiquitous, we're able to specialize more. And I think I understand the principle of what you're saying. I think where the challenge is when we say that we're making assumptions about how the society is actually working. So, like, for example, state of Maine, and you can go Google this right now if you like, of the goods we consume in terms of like food, like vegetation, meat, so on and so forth, over 85% of it comes from outside the state. So is agriculture ubiquitous in the state, or is it not? Same thing could be said for the meat supply for America. It's about 75% of our total meat is not made in America. It comes from foreign countries and comes in. I know that a lot of conservatives, I'm pretty sure Chuck would probably have some concerns about why are we bringing all this stuff in. So when we say ubiquitous, we're using the idea in terms of as humans as a whole, we have conquered this thing. But the thing is, like, we don't live, as much as the globalists would hate to hear this, we don't live in a truly 100% globalized place where, like, I think Iran taught us that, where because of this conflict, gas prices spiked, even though America is now the biggest, I think we had the biggest.
We're the largest net exporter, yes.
Our gas prices still went up to almost $5 a gallon. Like, so there's all these things, all these assumptions and terms we make in terms of markets, ubiquitous agriculture, access to power, with all these things. Those things can only operate when you have a paradigm that is consistent and is continuous. The minute there's a spike in any change in that continuous chain, the entire assumption breaks down and becomes right back to the whole idea of like, we need fucking fuel. Like, we've been using reserves for the last 4 weeks to get the prices where they are now, which is part of the reason why people think that Trump is signing up the peace deal. The second point, right before I go to Joe after this, the second point, and I also take your point with this too, is that Elon did an amazing thing when he bought X, and he definitely changed the paradigm when it came to speech. However, again, I think we make this assumption that the paradigm has shifted more than it has. So, for example, if you go ahead and make critiques of a certain Middle Eastern country that has a star on its flag, you will see your post like downgraded down to like almost non-existence. So like if you go and look at your typical post from a pro-Zionist poster versus someone who is an anti-Zionist poster, although you would see when you look at like the demographics of X, you see more people probably like more on the anti-Zionist side is because of the age groups and so on and so forth. You will see far more engagement with the pro-Zionist points. To the point that right now, if you go on Grok and ask it to give you a synopsis of Israel's effect in terms of politics on America, it will not answer your question.
Nope, I've done it.
So is that truly us? He freed speech, or he freed certain types of speech and other types of speech are still restricted? Because I think this is the thing, that the trap that we fall into when we talk about people like Elon Musk, or to Chuck's point, these big corporations. I think we have to make the assumption that in this crony system that we live in, if you are able to succeed to the place of making $1 trillion, is because you probably made some trade-offs with the system to get to that point. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the trap that we fall into, is that we defend the Elons from the communists. But if you think that Elon did not have a conversation with someone somewhere and they said, hey, do what the fuck you want. These are our 5 red lines. You cross any of them, you're either in jail or you broke. If we don't think that conversation didn't happen, I think that we're being very naive. So I think that's the point where we have to be careful when we go ahead and go, yes, communist, bad, evil, wrong, agreed. However, to make these people the heroes of capitalism or free markets or ingenuity, this is the same time where you have like Palantir is creating all these different camera systems. Elon, SpaceX is being used actively in the Ukraine and the Middle East and other places to go ahead and be used for warfare. So yes, he has done lots of positives. My point, I think, I'm not even going to get the leftists this because I don't think they make this point because they're idiots. But my point would be, yes, he has made very, very good inroads. But the inroads he made are in places where he's allowed to do so. So is that something you should truly give him credit for? Or that the system giving you just enough cake so that way you don't go ahead and riot? Joe, I'm going to get your view.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff that was covered
Take
here.
that.
And I wanted to be able to hop back and touch on a few other things, but I'll remain germane to the question asked here, aside from the point that I would like to make about the reframing of Elon's valuation as being a trillionaire at this point, equating it to 2.5 million engineers, is basically, in my mind at least, parallel to the framing that leftists have made, that they have the expectation that he can basically just walk into the bank and walk out with $1 trillion in his pocket, type of thing. It's a matter of,
bag, real big.
yeah,
because they don't understand economics at all. That's why.
yeah, but the engineer argument also falls into the same sort of trap. It's a reframing of what that value represents and how it was accumulated. And you make a lot of fair points, later on in your response, where it is, very questionable, to me at least, whether, he wasn't, kind of compromised in some capacity. I mean, there's pictures of him with a yarmulke on, kissing the wall. So, there's some issues to be looked into there, and that type of thing. But it's also the fact that he is, for as much credit as Dane gives him as being a somebody who saved free speech, it's very selective. He claimed to be a free speech absolutist, and hands out bans pretty freely, without necessarily the most absolutist sort of stance justifying it. But I mean, I guess I don't expect any differently. He has taken this public company private. He gets to make the rules. It's not free. It's still private approval of the speech that's allowed on his platform. So free speech, it more pertains to the government regulation of speech, in my mind. Twitter is permissioned speech, no matter how you slice it. There's better platforms that really lean into the more absolutist sort of free speech perspective. Nostr being one of them, where it is a totally decentralized social media platform.
It gets a little freaky on there, which is why.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah, but if that's what we're going to talk about as being the definition of free speech, that's it more than X is. Anyway, to kind of come back around to what was just brought up when it comes to, I guess, the obligation that Elon has, from one perspective, still seems to be a very extractive perspective. He's a trillionaire because, to hear leftists explain, is he stole, and stole being underpaying his workers. So those engineers should actually be being paid, $250,000 or something, according to some of the
$400,000 a year right now. So fast.
Sure. I think most of us probably would be quite comfortable and okay with $400K a year. But I'm just saying, the way that the framing works, from what I've seen on the left perspective, is that, yes, these people become so wealthy because they underpay their workers. They don't give them health care. They don't give them, a basic living wage and that type of thing. And from I guess the right perspective of this is that somehow he just did everything to earn and deserve the wealth that he's accumulated, and to question the means by which he did acquire it seems to be somehow anti-American, in the sense that, well, I could earn $1 billion and I wouldn't want anybody else questioning me about how I earned it, because I would do it the right way. And the assumption is that Elon must have, because he wouldn't have been able to get that rich otherwise, is kind of how I've seen things go back and forth between the two perspectives. So I don't choose to pick a side as to which one is right or wrong, because the libertarian in me says there's so many factors absent that would really give the truest picture of how much value did Elon actually create. Absent all of the government contracts that he's taken, and all of the money, the taxpayer money that's been funneled into these businesses, how much value has he actually created? The free market didn't decide that. We can only kind of speculate to certain portions of it. Tesla, sure, yeah, that's kind of a good example. But then again, there was huge energy credits to buy a Tesla a handful of years ago, that type of thing. So it's, the picture we have is not a true and accurate picture to make a real kind of solid judgment on the way things have played out now, a decade later, and Elon Musk being the first trillionaire. It's such an obscured and obfuscated sort of market and regulatory system that it's dishonest kind of on its face, from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong point. So I think the reason why we got to the Elon point, I think this tie in very well into the whole idea of social contract. I think this is to the point I think we've all made, is that leftists try to use social contract theory to say that now Elon must solve world hunger, which of course we would all agree is like, that's not the actual social contract. It's more like Elon shouldn't build the Terminator so that way we all get killed. Like that's the stuff. Like he's so smart and has so much access to capital and ingenuity and engineering that yeah, I like that you have like I like my Starlink. Just I don't want Starlink to turn into like to Skynet. And as long as you don't do that, are you really violating the social contract? I think that's where we get the tie-in. But I think this is where I'm curious to get Tim and Chuck back into this would be how we got to this place. So I think this is the interesting part is that we talked about like the traditional English and French Enlightenment, like the classical liberal school. Even if you look at like classic conservatism, like small c conservatism, you will see a lot of inroads where they had this view of the world that was very much based on, I'm going to use the terminology, but I'm sure there's better word, these like Anglo-Christian worldviews, or this idea of natural rights, where like Dane brought up previously. I think the issue that they've ran into, or the issue that we've run into, is that we have adopted, we've grafted other ways of thinking onto these things like natural rights. This one I know will upset Dane, so I'm very excited for this. I would think that like someone like Murray Rothbard is a perfect example of this. I would say that in terms of like modern economic theory, I tend to be more Miesian or Rothbardian in terms of my view. But I do think their blind spot, the biggest blind spot, is that they use things like natural rights theory to explain why the market should exist the way it is. But the thing is, natural rights has moral oughts. It has prescriptions. It's not just a definition, it is a prescription. Because there are these moral yes and no's, you should and must do this or else X. And a lot of Rothbardian and Miesian views try to give some flexibility there because you go into coercion and force and things that libertarians will talk about. Same thing with Ayn Rand. I think that's what she did was that she created this moral framework where we now see the idea like you having an obligation to people around you as inherently like coercive. So it's like if I have an obligation to someone else, why should I have to have an obligation? Ayn Rand made that point like several times where she actually like purposely rejected like the Catholic Catechism. I don't know if you guys have ever read it. I think it's fantastic because I think it's one of the sloppiest things she ever did, which is why as a Catholic it makes me so happy that she couldn't refute my church. Is that she makes this argument of like, well, the catechism assumes that like because Dane, you are a person, Jason, I am person. Dane, if I see you in X position that is less optimal than my position, and you're telling me I have an obligation to help Dane become more optimal in his living conditions, well, you're coercing me to have to do that. If I choose to do it, great. If I choose not to do it, it's a net. There's no moral yes or good. There's no moral no or bad. And I think those are the problems that Rothbard, Rand ran into, is that they use a lot of this framework that was based on a view of morality that they did not share. And I think the one thing that conservatism actually did very well was that they tried to hold on to that actual moral framework, which is why you have the big Christian conservative movement and conservatism to this day, which is why you had all but two signers of the Constitution. Only two Constitution signers were deists. The rest were all Anglos. Basically, they're all different forms of Protestants. So, like, even our founders, to an extent, acknowledged that there are moral oughts, moral prescriptions that they felt need to be made for society to work the way they wanted to. And that's something that I think that modern libertarianism just tries to refuse to do. And a lot of parts of conservatism, Chuck, so I'll get it to Chuck. I think this is my critique of modern conservatism, is that I understand the idea of a big tent to invite as many people in as you can, because that's how you're going to win politics. I get that point. But if your tent is so big that the morals and ethics in which your tent is built on, that foundation that the stakes are in, if those morals and ethics aren't compatible and that foundation starts to crack, is it worth having a big tent if it all crumbles to the ground anyway? What do you think, Chuck?
Well, I want to talk about the other stuff too. I have a lot of thoughts about Elon and all that other kind of stuff. But I think the short version is obviously there is a degree to which you cannot expand the tent without tearing the tent, essentially. And I think that where you kind of make the limits are on like the classic, I would say classic. I know that we've talked about classical liberalism and there are some problems with classical liberalism in general. But like our country is essentially founded largely on those types of principles, right? The idea of free speech and like this representative democratic republic, and and that like basically we're trying to expand the Republican tent at this point to include anyone who's on that page so that we can defeat the radical left, so that then we can fight about the areas where we don't agree, because there's a significant amount of disagreement within the Republican movement. But there are places where I do think the tent begins to tear. And I think it's hard to necessarily know exactly what those are going to be. I'm trying to focus more on the areas that will bring us together, so that we can defeat the radical left. But in the Elon Musk element of the conversation, I think it's really interesting. One of the things I was thinking about as you guys were talking is it, like, one Elon Musk, or how many of these engineers, like, and I think one of the things that the reason that Elon Musk is so, I think, not particular, is so wealthy. We'll just say part of the reason that he's so wealthy is because he's so rare. And part of the reason that he's so rare is because we have he is a unique specimen. No matter what time frame he would have come in, I think he would have been an incredibly successful man. He's been able to be so much more successful because we live in a society that breeds mediocrity. And so, number one, we need to create a society that focuses, we need to have more people who are more than just an engineer, right? We don't need, as I think somebody else was saying, we don't necessarily need more engineers. We need more people doing really unique and creative things. And one of the other factors that plays into why he is a trillionaire at this point is because there aren't other people creating different ideas. Like, I used to work in banking. I used to help people, and I did a lot of time studying the stock market and didn't really recommend individual stocks, but I paid attention to those types of things very closely. And one of the reasons that IPOs are so exciting for the markets is because there aren't enough things to invest in, right? There aren't enough new companies where where the big investment companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and the even the hedge funds and all these other institutional investors, they don't have enough stuff to invest in. And so, in my opinion, when I look at the fundamentals of SpaceX projections and stuff like that, like, I don't think it's necessarily probably worth what it's currently trading at the current level. Now, there's a lot of expectation around future growth, but a big part of the reason that it boomed and it got all this money is because there are so few really exciting IPOs these days. There are so few people that are doing unique things. Now, part of that gets back to the conversation we had earlier in the economic system that this kind of, like, some people would call it late stage capitalism, other people would call it crony capitalism, whatever you want to call it, where the major corporations effectively control the Washington to make sure that they get away with stuff and they can grow and other people can't compete with them. That issue is the bigger issue. It's not Elon and what should be done with his money. It's and whether we should take that money and give it to a bunch of engineers or something along those lines. It's more, we need to fix our society. We need to fix those mechanisms to ensure that we have a system that is set up to encourage more people to do unique and cool things that people are going to want to be able to invest in. And Elon himself, like, talk about the engineers. Yeah, so they make 400 to 500,000, and that is a lot of money. It doesn't sound like a lot compared to what he's worth, but he in all of his companies, he builds in stock options. And so cafeteria workers at SpaceX, I think everybody heard, right, are now millionaires. So the engineers they're doing okay. They're making more than 400 to 500,000 when you factor all that stuff in. There, I think I saw something that said that there were 4,400 new millionaires as a result of SpaceX. Yep. So it's not just Musk who became a trillionaire. It's all of that. But you can redirect me back to your original question, but I felt like I wanted to dive into that and I couldn't help myself.
Wow. I think I'm happy you added that. I think that's valid. I think that's a really good critique of the critique, is that, again, like, I'm going to try to reframe this. I think that you're right, and that I think that's where these arguments that traditionally we consider more left-leaning do fall apart, is that there's always to Joe's point, there's all this gray area and nuance that often gets left out of this conversation, like the stock options, or like, doesn't have $1 trillion underneath his mattress. If he did, he'd be at the fucking moon right now. So, like, that's not how the world actually operates. So when we have these conversations, there's a lot of abstractions being made. But I think that was a very good point. To get back to, I guess, what I was trying to say previously was, I think I'm curious where you think we've diverted from. Like, and I think I have a very similar worldview when it comes to you in terms of liberalism, where I, as someone who identifies as a libertarian, am often very sympathetic to, like, the post-liberal or anti-liberal worldview in terms of, liberalism is great if you live in this place at this time. You have mostly an Anglo-white Protestant country. You don't have 20 million illegals crossing into your country over 4 years. You don't have over 2,000 bases across the world. Like, if those things don't exist, sure, liberalism is a fantastic system, and libertarianism could be like it'd be the greatest experiment ever ran. but do we actually live in that world? And I think the reason we fall into that is because of the things like Rothbard. And I'll try to be, if people don't know, I have a like honest distaste for Ayn Rand, like honest distaste, because I feel that some of her critiques against others, she is also culpable for. At the end of the day, I think she was just like a really angry, degenerate woman who's just like ranting. And I'm also a traditional Catholic, so women, you shouldn't be able to vote. Or no, I'm just joking, kind of. So just throw that out there. But I think we have adopted these worldviews that are 30, 40 years old that borrow a lot of terminology from worldviews that are 300 years old, and we assume that they're the same thing. So I think, do you think that's actually the case, Chuck, where we're basically we're playing Weekend at Bernie's with some of the worldviews from our successors?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think if I can even understand the question, but I think like I think we're in this really unique time in history where we don't even know who we are and where we are and what our foundation is and why. What is it about America that makes it so great? We as a society are divided on that, right? We're so broken, and I think there's so much confusion within every movement, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans or the Libertarians. I don't know, I'm not as schooled in libertarian thought, but within, one of the things that's interesting, this is kind of an anecdotal aside, but it's like we supposedly have this like two-party system, and then obviously you've got the Libertarians and you've got the Greens, as I think there might be some other party out there somewhere. The No Labels, I don't think they're a party necessarily, but they're trying to pretend to exist. Another Democrat attempt to trick people. Anyway, but the reality is, like, within the Republican Party, you have a lot of diversity of thought, right? You have a significant, especially here in Maine politics, there's a significant number of people that are impacted and hold more of a libertarian worldview or ideology, like David Boyer, Laurel Libby, and even like one of the conservative news outlet, that is kind of the part of an outworking of the think tank Maine Policy. They're very libertarian minded, is my understanding. Some of them are unenrolled, some of them are Republicans, some of them are actually libertarians, but the reality is they're very libertarian in their thought process and their ideology. You also have your like really kind of more your religious conservatives, that the moral values and those types of issues are the primary drivers. And then you have people that are just, I don't even understand. Oh, well, the big business and just pro kind of more the pro capitalism, and they don't really necessarily care so much about having any restrictions on capitalism, but they're just like pro business. And these tend to, a lot of these are just like, they're not even really, not a lot of thought goes into it. They're business owners, and they want to be able to make money, and they don't want restrictions on that. They want a healthy economy, right? And so like within, and I think we could go into the Democrat side and talk about the fact that there are a number of different, I mean, they're really not anymore. The radicals have largely taken over, but you've got the historic, and I think you see some of this in both sides, but you've got the establishment Democrats, and then you have the radical Democrats, and that's basically all that you've got left on the Democrat side. There are some people on the Democrat side that consider themselves to be libertarian, in their libertarianism tends to be primarily in how you live your life and your moral ethics, rather than obviously economics, although there is some degree of that with them as well. And so I think we as a society in general are very confused on what we believe and what philosophy is ruling and guiding us, which is why we've given into populism so effectively, right? And that's, populism is why Trump got elected, not necessarily because he had the best policies. Now, I do think he had some incredible policies, but he wasn't elected because he had the best policies. He was elected because he was a very popular person, and populism, I don't know. I studied a little bit about Rome, and I don't know that populism leads in a positive place. But anyway, I don't think I've answered the question, but I rambled for a while, so hopefully that was effective.
I think it was great. I think that actually leads right into the next part that we should move into, is the Realpolitik conversation, because you brought up the populism point, which I think feeds into that Realpolitik. The idea being that like that your politics is a reflection of the attitude of the culture in which you live in. And to your point, Chuck, I think that that's how you get this whole populist thing, because you have like populist right, which is kind of what I think Trump is trying to capture on. But you do have like this populist left, which I think is just, I think we would agree, all of us here, that is just like very soft coding for semi-communism. So it's like, we're not going to go full communist because we know people don't like that, but we'll take some of the core like tenets and like kind of mold them a little bit to make it populist left. But that's my critique. I'm sure that people who are populist left would have an explanation to why they think it's a valid worldview. But I think that's the Realpolitik is that the traditional lines that used to be drawn for I am a conservative, I am a classical liberal, I am a modern liberal, I am a whatever a libertarian, I'm an anarchist, whatever that means. See what I did there? I'm whatever label. I think these labels used to work when we had a view of the world where we go, yeah, if I get enough people who are liberal thinking and we all vote the same way, the society will be liberal and we'll all be happy and we'll be able to live in this liberal utopia. Like there was this idea that if we just all get together and all decide that this thing is the way it needs to be, that the world will reflect that. And I think what Realpolitik teaches us is like, sure, but like you have to make sure that government can't go ahead and collude against you. And like you have to make sure that these large corporations aren't spending $30 million to oust Thomas Massey. And these foreign lobbies aren't going ahead and doing the same thing. Like if you can go ahead and guarantee that those things aren't happening, sure. Like populism can work, libertarianism can work. I still refuse that communism could ever work large. There was a recent poll that came out where they had 5,000 young men and they put them in a room and they were talking about society and democracy and the Constitution. They said, okay, all these things that we said the country is. Guys, raise your hands. If tomorrow the country needed you to go fight to protect the American way, how many of you guys would do it? Out of 5,000, 6 hands went up. So I think like that's one of those things where, okay, there's obviously this feeling about what America is and isn't. Like if you had to bring someone into the tent and explain to them why this worldview would be the answer, what would be your pitch?
And it's a noble, cause, but on the other hand, I'd say the real problem is that people are allowed to choose as much as they are able to. What I mean by that is, we've spoken a little bit about how we actually live not in a democracy, but in a constitutional republic. That was supposed to have meant that the mob cannot take the rights away of the minority, right? The majority, the tyranny of the majority.
Mm-hmm.
But that ship has long sailed, I think. Even income taxation at all, I regard as a tyranny of the majority. I think ideally the republic would work. It would work if we had an actual republic where you couldn't vote to have Elon Musk pay more in taxes. That's not even up for a debate.
Justin Amash, says this all the time that, the limitations of the government are enumerated in the Constitution. Anything really outside of that is illegitimate. Like people being able to, vote on how much money, they can extract from somebody else just because, the greater good says that they, want or need this, that, or the other project. Go back to pre-1913 before the, federal income tax was, signed into law, and you have a lot of the kind of modern infrastructure and amenities that did occur. They did get built. Roads were, we had roads, we had, fire brigades, police departments, etc., all absent a federal income tax. And then since that point, you can just see that the bloat in the bureaucracy and the spiraling debt that's occurred, especially post 1971 and what have you, is just there's no real justification that makes a lot of sense based on the kind of return on investment we see that should have been allowed. The just absolute waste, fraud, abuse that's rampant in so many current government agencies, and I'm sure it stretches back to the point where taxation even started, where it was just misallocation of capital resulting in poor results, year after year after year. And the answer, instead of, reassessing the validity or the strategy of a particular project, bureau, etc., the answer is always, well, they just need more money, just need more funding, and then we'll be able to sort it out. Look at the homeless problem in California, where they've sunk $25 billion into trying to address homelessness, eliminate homelessness, what have you, and it's actually just gotten worse. It's staggering, just the ineptitude and incompetency that's rewarded with taxpayer dollars, and there's no kind of going back to the drawing board or a kind of withholding of further funds because you're not getting any results. And that's the thing that I think people really sort of have been sold when it comes to they just need more funding, and somehow they believe it, time after time after time, instead of being like, nope, we've got to stop this. everybody take your money back. We need to figure some other solution out. There's no entertaining of any alternative solutions, which a libertarian is kind of just, rife with when it comes to alternative solutions. And sometimes the solution is, or at least the answer is, I don't know, we need to try a bunch of different things aside from what we've been trying and having no positive return on investment. So being open to that sort of exploring new territory is so just, it evokes like a fear reaction out of people. They would prefer the devil they know and have it fail repeatedly, as opposed to trying something different, which might fail, but it might also improve things. And that's the part that I don't know why people can't kind of get behind. At least give yourself a chance for things to see some kind of improvement unless, doing the same thing. No, but this time it'll be different. They've got more money now. It's insanity, the definition of it to me.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, with that, I'm going to try to pull Chuck and Dane into the same conversation. So, Dane, I'll get to you because I know that me and you have some conversations about Realpolitik, and we're actually pretty much, we agree on a lot when it comes to this. So I am going to use extreme young person verbiage when I say this.
So
Great.
I won't understand it all.
Well, this is going to be good. I'm glad it's recorded.
Guys, it's going to be real. I don't know what the fuck I'm saying, man. But anyway.
No, carry on.
Shoulda, coulda, woulda. Great. We should have had a constitutional republic, and it should have been that way. We don't. We should have not had universal suffrage. We do. We shouldn't have the Federal Reserve. We do. We shouldn't have the income tax. We do. We shouldn't have big government. We do. Now what? Because I think this is the trouble that I think this is why, and to your point, Tim, I think this is where, so when I think Dane knows this, which is why he doesn't yell at me when I do this, but I think when it comes to libertarianism, because I had a very big nerdy part of my life where I read way too many books, I probably didn't do anything to help me, but I read them anyway. I know I understand the conceptual ideas of a lot of these things, and I agree with many of them. I think the challenge is that there is a difference between like theory and reality. Like there's a famous term within the military is that like, yeah, every plan is perfect until the enemy makes contact. Like, yeah, like you can have the best war plan ever. The first time a bullet is shot, now what do you do? Like, and what if the first thing that was supposed to happen doesn't happen? Now what? And I think that's the issue that, to your point, Tim, I think that's the issue that we as libertarians run into, is that if you go to a 22-year-old who's known nothing but a world with the Patriot Act, who's known nothing but the Federal Reserve being what it is, who knows that he probably never will get to own a home, where he knows that like 80% of the wealth is owned by the boomers, like when he knows these things to be true, and you tell him what we need is more liberty and more freedom, and he goes, fuck you, liberty and freedom. I want my fucking piece of the pie. And if it means I have to be anti-liberty and anti-freedom, God damn it, I'm going to do it. What is our answer to that? So, Dane, what is, as the chair of the Libertarian Party of Being, our faithful leader, what is the answer to that Realpolitik critique?
So, ask the question more succinctly.
Sure. So, Realpolitik would say that yes, we agree. We should be following the Constitution. Federal Reserve is illegitimate. The universal suffrage, I know we both agree on this, is illegitimate. All these things are legitimate, but they do exist. This is the world we live in. It is, the average person doesn't really care about liberty or freedom. I think we all could agree with that. If you go to the average normie who's not a libertarian or a small C conservative and use words like liberty or freedom, they're like, great. Are my bills paid? Do I have food on my table? Then whatever. So if that's the world we live in, how do we combat that nihilism? How do we move them towards the liberty and freedom view that Tim would like more people to have?
Honestly, I think stressing the importance of individual sovereignty, I think, is a good place to start. And from the, some people aren't able to start families right now because it's just too damn expensive, right? Okay, so your immediate inroad there, wouldn't it be great if the government didn't steal 35-40% of your income? Like, yes, it would. And okay, cool. Would you be willing to, kick grandma off of Social Security in order to do that? Most people are probably going to say no, right? So, it's difficult there. I think that we have a little bit of a caged bird never flies paradigm going on here, that like people don't understand how important the ability to make your own choices in every aspect of your life really is, because we haven't really lived that way or been brought up that way. I mean, and there are many, many different reasons for that. I mean, most of us probably were indoctrinated in the public school system, and you know, are brought up in a kind of daddy government's going to take care of us, and not brought up in a I need to figure out my shit and be able to protect my own self, and go secure the resources my own self, rather than being doled out on a monthly paycheck. It's a valid question, and it's very difficult to kind of nutshell it in a soundbite. But I think approaching that question to the individual, like through the idea of, don't you want to make all your own choices and not have anyone tell you what to do, is a good place to start.
Fair. Very fair. Chuck, so I want to pull you into this too, because as the non-libertarian on the team, I'm curious what your view would be, because, and so like I'm going to bring it to Maine, because like on previous episodes, we've talked about Maine particularly when it comes to a lot of this stuff. So when we talk about Maine, for example, I believe the latest statistic, if I refreshed it this morning, was about 56% of Mainers are on some type of state assistance. So in the world where libertarians, we get our dream and go, hey, listen, like that assistance has to go away because it's being gained with robbing my income from me at 40-something%, which I think most of us probably get taxed at when you look at federal and state and everything combined. And now you go to 56% of Maine and say, guess what? It's going away. And they go, screw you, I'm gonna vote you out of office. How do you, as a GOP rep, how do you broach those conversations and explain to them what is and is not a solution?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that I would say is like one of my favorite people in world history when it comes to politics. Before I ever got involved in politics, I didn't know that I was going to get involved in politics, but I look back at some of my favorite pieces of art, which are movies, by the way, and I'm like, oh, these are some of my favorites. So clearly I've been thinking politically for a long time. I mean, one of them is this guy named William Wilberforce, right? And so I think he gets critiqued, I think, a little bit, and he critiques other people on this idea of making changes gradually. Right. So but the reality is, like with a lot of those things, I mean, you have to it seems like we've got two options. Either we've got to figure out how to move toward liberty gradually, or we revolt, right? Like there really is no middle ground, right? The challenge, and I think the reason that people don't like the answer of like, we need to be able to do things gradually is because we feel like we're never going to get there, because gradually ends up being like, let's just talk national politics. And, again, I'm supportive of the current administration by and large, but what policies have we passed to roll back the things that have been added on by the Democrats? And what things have we done to, for instance, address the national deficit and things along those lines? And ultimately, we haven't really done a lot. And what you end up seeing is the Democrat Party gets elected and they largely take away freedoms, in my opinion. And then the Republicans get elected and they lower taxes. But they don't roll back a lot of the things, some of the things, but not a lot of the things, not enough of the things. In this case, Trump has done so by a bunch of executive orders, but nothing in terms of like policy passed by Congress. And so the concern that the average person, I think, has is, well, like gradually means never. So like, what's the point, right? And so you've got either we've got to go like extreme, or we need to I don't know, give up, throw up our hands, and just kind of deal with it. But I think the reality is the answer is similar. I bring up William Wilberforce for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that he did change the world gradually. Now, gradually, but committed and never stopping. He lived his entire life, and by the time he died, the year that he died, they finally did what he sought to do and what kept him in politics, which was abolishing slavery in the British Empire, right? But it took him his entire life. And so we need to recognize that some of these changes that seem so obvious to us that we definitely feel like we need to fix tomorrow, yesterday, are things that it may take us some time to do. But if we're committed to it and we work hard at it, I think we can make that kind of progress as William Wilberforce did. But in order to get there, we need to be willing to do things that feel mean and unkind. And I think somebody made the comment about how we've been indoctrinated by, whether it's the public education system or just our society at large. Because like, even if you're homeschooled, you still have access to other things. And so many elements of our society, the worst thing you could possibly be is mean or unkind. Even if you're doing what's in somebody's best interest, like to not give money to an addict, knowing that they're going to use it. That's mean. We got to, I mean, maybe we got to help them. We got to give them new needles so that they don't die of, something wrong with the needle, so that they can have their heroin, which might kill them. Because maybe it's possible that, right, we need to be willing to say no. We need to do difficult things that people feel are mean and unkind, and that's something we have to just decide to do. One of the best examples of this right now is the issue of immigration, right, where some people don't want to deport people who came here. I sometimes use the term less than legally, right? Some people are like, deport, even if they came here legally. Let's get them out because we need America for the Americans, right? But you have people who are against. They'll tell you that they're against illegal immigration, but then when it comes to that person who's a really nice person who came here and yet technically they overstayed their visa, they got married after they overstayed their visa, so they couldn't change their visa status, and now they're being deported. And sob story. I feel bad for them, but they broke the law, and that's why they're being deported, and they need to be deported, and we need to be okay with that. So we need to be okay with being mean, or according to today's standards, or unkind. And then I'll shut up really shortly. And when I think about the Republican Party, kind of what we need to be and focus on, and kind of the message that we need to push forward, because I'm the Republican, you guys are not, is that being the party of empowerment, is getting back at, we want people to be able to be free to do what they want to do and how they want to do it, and be able to live on their own without needing help from the government or anybody else. So anyway.
That was fantastic. You never have to shut up, Chuck. You're fantastic just the way you are, but you're good. No, I think that's very apropos. I do think this. I think me, Dan, Joe have all agreed on this, and I'm curious to what your take is. I think that's why we have, as a party, at times said, how can we work with maybe some of the Republicans in the state? I think it has to do with what you just said, where one, there's a lot of Republicans in the state who probably are more libertarian-minded than they probably know, just because libertarianism is very much for people who like to listen to podcasts and read lots of books and talk about theory and so on and so forth. So you have to have a little bit of tism to really enjoy libertarianism, which I think all of us would acknowledge. We probably have to a certain extent, Dane more than anybody else. But I also think that because there's so much agreement between what you said, Chuck, and I think what Dane said, what Joe said, and what Tim, I think, actually understands to be the case, where I think Tim is where I was when I first became a libertarian, where I was like, if they would just fucking do it, man. If they just said, hey, you're right, the world would be all the world's problems would be solved. Tim, I think you are right. If they would just go, yep, let's try it. And I think you made the analogy, Dane, the idea of a caged bird, or Joe made up, maybe Joe gave that point. Is that if we just tried these things out,
or
we think
just at least tried something different. Yeah. It just, I get very pragmatic about the kind of, if we're doing the same thing over and over again and not seeing any success with what's being attempted, why do we keep doing it?
The literal definition of insanity.
That's what I mean. And that seems such a foreign concept to a lot of people when you say, we can both, I could be talking to somebody, we both agree that, XYZ, system is broken. And, I'll throw out some sort of, libertarian solution that I've heard, one of the deeper thinkers, bring to the forefront. And they'll sort of, not necessarily recoil physically, but they'll just, kind of I don't know, what if we just made this little tweak here? And maybe it would work then. And there's no real basis other than what if I just, voted harder next time, or really believed that it would work, then it would actually manifest and happen, as opposed to just, take a sober look at the things that we've poured, millions, trillions, however much of taxpayer dollars into. And do you feel satisfied with the return that you see from that? If the answer is no, you should probably stop doing that. I don't know how much more plainly it can be presented. This is clearly not working. Let's stop doing that and try something else. I'm not saying we have to just, tear the whole system down, but we take a turn towards a different approach somehow. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me, but it is. It definitely seems like a lot of people do see it that way, where it's unreasonable to try something so drastically different. Because, and I'll say it again, it's always just being, sold to the people oh, they just needed more funding. If they had a bigger budget, they'd be able to accomplish more. And these budgets have gotten so insanely bloated I think we talked about it the other day, where it's something to the tune of 115 days out of the year you basically work for free because the government takes all of that money. And then you look at it like that. That's a third of the year, practically. What am I getting out of working for free for a third of the entire year?
Bombing brown children halfway across the world.
Right. And those are like, no, thank you. No, thank you. Actually, I would rather, you not do that. And that just
you bring up
puts
brown people because Joe is brown. How dare you, Dane?
Anyway. The point being that, if you had the context of, any other scenario, I have to kind of just tangent for just a minute here, and I'll be as succinct as I can. So my father has put in, 23 years in the military. He collects a decent pension. He's also collecting Social Security and has been for 10 years now. And we had a conversation where he had talked about Social Security, needs to be fixed, blah, blah, blah. And I had my, libertarianism flare up for a few minutes, and it had to kind of question him as to like, all right, well, what needs to happen? And he gave some kind of, broad strokes answers. And then we kind of got into the more kind of nitty gritty of it, and we worked through how much money he had actually contributed to Social Security, because he has the same stance that a lot of boomers have, where it's like, I put that money, into Social Security. I want every penny that I put into it, back from my retirement, etc. But when you break down the numbers, and I have a friend who works for Social Security here in Maine who can verify, my kind of very generous numbers that we came up with. It's approximately 12.4% of your entire income across your whole life. But that's the highest point it's been at since Social Security's inception. It was much lower percentages being contributed over the years until then. So for the example of my father, I was generous, gave him $150,000 over the course of his career is what was put into Social Security for him. $150,000. Okay. Since he's been collecting for the past 10 years, he's pulled out $200,000. So this is the type of system that is clearly broken and unsustainable, but people will fight to the death to defend it, and believe that they are, absolutely entitled to all of the money that's taken out of it. But they'll start at the point of, I want the money that I put into it. It's like, all right, you got that.
Literally,
plus
they know
50K.
that the money is completely fake.
Well, but it's just, I'm just trying to more so make the kind of example of there's a misunderstanding of how all of these programs and systems work, and people just hold on to that because it makes them feel good, and that could be
that's by design as well.
Exactly. And that's what people hold on to, more than, facing the reality of, no, this system's broken. It's not sustainable. They keep pushing up the retirement age for people because of that. Like, you were able to collect, at 67, for me, I'd be lucky if it was 70 when I could start to collect Social Security. And eventually it'll go beyond that because it's not sustainable. It's a broken system, and people will not, just assess that and do something to kind of course correct now. They'll continue to make the tweaks and adjustments that they think will kind of at least kick the can down the road, because they're not interested in actually fixing it. Because that requires, like Chuck was saying, doing something that's mean,
right?
Effectively.
There's an argument to be made, though, that the system isn't broken; it's operating exactly as it was designed.
Sure. There's that argument.
And a lot of the pearl clutching comes from a place of complete ignorance of the fact that, you think you're entitled to your Social Security. Little do you know that, it's completely insolvent and has been for decades, right? Mm-hmm. It was never intended to be what it is right now. It was intended to be a safety net for those that, fell on hard times later in life. And what it ended up becoming was a UBI of sorts for the elderly, all the while for the past 13 years, our currency has been completely based in, a figment of the imagination. So, and because people don't understand that, they think that there's just, the money printer still goes burr, and I get my, grandma and grandpa still get their paychecks, and I get my Christmas toy or whatever.
Right. Yeah, but the actual, having to do something mean, as Chuck was saying, is so abhorrent to people. The fact that this system's broken, That doesn't matter. We just need to kick the can down the road. Whereas another option, and this is another one that the leftists like to, break out, is like, oh, we ought to have a social safety net like, Switzerland, Sweden, or whatever. And I can, retort like, oh, so we should privatize Social Security. I agree. And they just look at me like I have three heads, because they don't realize the social safety nets that are, present in these Nordic countries that they love to kind of espouse as being the model for social safety nets are mostly privatized, like to a degree that would just boggle the mind if it were kind of implemented here. And it's that fundamental misunderstanding, and to a point, it's willful ignorance. You shouldn't be saying that this is the model we should follow and not understand how it actually fucking works.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. One, if you're investing money wisely, you should definitely pull out more money than you put in, because if it's growing in the market, I think it should be that if you put $150,000 away, you should take more than $200,000 out. Your overall point, though, I agree with. I just wanted to note that, like, that's actually something, because I used to work, again, I worked in this, like, your money would have grown over time. So maybe you put in $150,000, but if it's invested wisely, it's going to grow to a place where you're going to be able to take out much more than
Social Security.
No, that's what I mean, though. So, like, if Social Security were a pension, right, and it hadn't been robbed from by the government, and it actually existed as a pension and was invested in the market and was growing, then you would be able to pull out $200,000 and still have more to take from without it having gone to zero. But the overall point, like, so these social safety nets and all these other things, one of the biggest problems I have with them is that they're based on the lowest common denominator. They're based on, we need to create a system that protects people who make really bad decisions, rather than a system that rewards people for good behavior, right? Yes. And that's the problem. Is like, oh, people didn't save for retirement, and also when it was created, I think the average life expectancy was closer to 70 years, and so if you did get it, right, you didn't get it for very long, so it wasn't a big problem. Now we live a lot longer. Now it's a big problem, but also they robbed from it. And again, I don't think we should reward people for bad behavior. I think it's one of the biggest steps towards socialism, which I think we're all against.
Yeah.
I agree.
But I don't think it's palatable to any of the voters to talk about getting rid of it.
Unfortunately, here's the left side pushback against that sentiment. And personally, I agree, but I'd also say it should apply across the board. People who make bad decisions shouldn't be rewarded. And when I hear you say that, I imagine you mean somebody who, has made poor life decisions, and kind of screwed their life up. But I also mean it in the sense that it should also apply to bank bailouts, for example.
100%.
So just as long as we could agree there, then yeah, I'm definitely glad to hear that reinforced, because that's the left side's calling out point, and it's 100% correct that if you have a business that is failing, the taxpayers have no obligation to bail you out. Your business is failing because it was mismanaged, poor decisions were made. You ruined the life of that business. You go out of business then. It's that simple.
Well, and the whole too big to fail nonsense was there simply because we already were in a problem situation in our society where we created a system. Again, that kind of crony capitalism, late stage capitalism, whatever you want to call it. I prefer crony capitalism because I don't want the system to fail. So like. But if we can move back away from that, right? But that was the problem, is that we had already basically created a system that benefited these major corporations. And then when they made really poor decisions, which were the reason that we never should have made laws to benefit them, because we gave them too much power and influence and ability to harm people, we then bailed them out for their poor decisions that destroyed not just our economy, but the global economy. And that is ridiculous. And not enough people went to jail.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody did. I don't know of anybody who did.
Yeah.
I think overseas bankers went to jail. I know I heard that. But but to kind of piggyback onto that, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jason. I apologize.
No, I'm saying this is how you get this is how communism keeps resurfacing its ugly head in the U.S. Is that this is the things that, to your point, John, to your point, Chuck, this is the thing that the left captures on, that they have some validity on, but again, their prescriptions are ridiculous. But they do make valid points in terms of like, all right, great. If I was the average congressman and investing via inside trading at the rate that they did, I'd be in prison for the rest of my life. Yeah. However, they don't. But the perfect example is a Navy SEAL who got in trouble because he invested in the success of the Venezuela operation.
Man.
Of like, you held him accountable. What about like 96% of Congress. Like, are you going to hold them accountable to the same standard? Of course you're not. And so I think this goes back to the whole social contract theory, which this whole conversation started with, is the social contract is congressman does it bad, it goes to jail. I do it bad, it goes to jail. And if that contract is violated, what you end up getting is people saying, well, if the contract is invalid, then I'm going to do whatever's in my own best interest, even if it does take away your freedom, your liberty, because if you're telling me that you can do it, well, why can't I do it? And this is where we end up at this place where we keep getting this. I think it's like every 25 years, communism starts to go back down just a little bit, and it ticks right back up. And usually it's around something like a housing crisis or a stock crash or something. And people realize, oh, the system isn't working the way that they told me it did when I was in 10th grade economics. Like they lied to me when they told me that that's how it worked. And to the point that Chuck made earlier, if the average boomer, so if the average person right now who is 65 years old when they were 25 started contributing $10 into a standard mutual fund, the average return right now would be $8.6 million. So these people would all be multimillionaires if they just would have invested. And I'm not even the biggest, just like you, Chuck. So like, Chuck, if you don't, well, we just met. So I used to work for JP Morgan Chase. I still have my Series 7. So like, I remember the reason why I left working in finance was like, oh, this is like a game. Like, it's a game that I'm not invited to play in, but the people who do get to play in it, damn, do they do really well for themselves. Like, God bless them for it.
And if you can figure out what they're doing and do it with them / ahead of them, you can make bank. Right. But that's the basic goal. Anyway,
just follow the Nancy Pelosi tracker on X. Yeah, and I think this year
so
her net return rate is like
hold on. It's I actually invest in that. I've got like $6,000 in that.
That's awesome.
I think it's up 24%. Hold on a second. 22.1% right now since I invested in it like a year and a half, 2 years ago.
She should have her own monument on Wall Street because obviously she's the greatest day trader in like American history. Like, God bless her.
Right.
So let's end this up. But before we do, I do want to do something that I think we're trying to get into a habit of. When we have these conversations, it does end up taking a bit of I think because we have to acknowledge what the current state of the world is, it tends to sound kind of nihilistic and a little like dark and gloomy because that just happens to be the current world atmosphere. But I do want to try to end this with a white pill. So if every single one of us can like think of something in terms of like, okay, what hope do we have? And I'd like to try to tie it into the whole social contract theory if possible. So I'll go first to give you guys like an example of what I'm talking about. I think that although the average person doesn't understand what social contract theory and this stuff is, I think they, to an extent, understand the general principle. As a Catholic, I would say because it's written on their heart, because they are a creature of God. So the idea of natural rights is engraved into their soul. And because of that, they understand that the world should be operating in a specific way. And I think that, especially Gen Z, I don't think they're at a place yet where they can properly articulate it, or that they'll even be able to make ideas yet that will probably be able to solve some of these issues. But I do think they're a bit more aware of this social contract violation, more so than the last few generations, and especially way more than like the Gen Xers and the Boomers who felt like the government would never lie to them and once a car crack was getting the truth all the time and blah, blah, blah. So I think that's my white pills, that even if they're not sitting in a podcast like all of us and having these wonderful intellectual conversations about social contract theory, I think that they are very aware of, hey, I'm supposed to be able to live my life in this specific way. These are the promises that I was guaranteed by being an American who lives in a constitutional republic with a constitutional with certain rights and provisions. Why is it that I can't live the way that I want to? Like, why is it that I can't buy a house? Why is it that if I want to get married and have 4 kids, it seems like it's an impossibility? Like, I think they are understanding that there's something that needs to be fixed. I think that's a very positive thing. Like, regardless of whether we agree with their solutions or not, I think the first step, just like in alcohol, is acknowledging that you have a problem. So I think the first step is that this younger generation has to acknowledge of, I want the American system to succeed, but I acknowledge that right now it's not the system that I was told it should be. So I need to actually fix it. And I think it's going to be up to our generations. I think all of us are at a similar age group. I think it's going to be up to us to guide them and try to mold them into the right direction and go, hey, this communism stuff is insane. But at the same time, this like corporatism, crazy technocratic thing, probably just as insane. How about we try to find this narrow pathway that we think could actually work? So I think that's my white pill, is that I think that in the next 20 or 30 years, if our generation capitalizes on it, that we may be able to make that incremental change that Chuck was talking about, where we're not going to necessarily have to like flip the entire system, but we're going to make enough changes where those institutions start to get some more trust again, where people feel like they want to be a part of the political process. And as that positive momentum grows, we'll see more incremental change towards the type of world that we would like to be living in as libertarians, as conservatives, as Republicans. I think that's something that's a really big white pill we could take from this. So, Joe, let's start with you. What's your white pill for the group?
I guess for me, it's a more personal type of white pill in that I sort of have really, crystallized in my mind and resonate with the concept of, planting the seeds of trees, beneath whose shade I will never sit. And that has to be my mentality at this point, because I feel bad that I took so long to be able to kind of wake up, open my eyes, and see the world and these problems for what they really are. And I really feel strongly motivated to try and spread the word, try and wake other people up so that they can build on whatever momentum I'm able to give them to actually, as you pointed out, fix these problems and steer them towards the ones that don't have us just repeating the failures of the past over and over.
Well said. Dane, what do you got?
Well, I mean, pretty much going to echo the same thing that Joe just said. I mean, I like to say to myself and in my house, and I know I say it to all of you guys all the time, that if not us, who? Right? It's one thing to have these thoughts and ideas. It's a completely other and way more important thing to actually go out and do something about it, to actually call your legislators and to actually email your town council and actually get involved in these things. And I think as far as a white pill goes, I mean, this generation of like the 20 somethings, what are they, Zoomers or Gen Z, whatever, this is the first generation in decades that has actually leaned more conservative or more right leaning than the previous generation, which might not sound like a white pill to some. However, to me, knowing what I know about the political divide, there tends to be a lot more of a monolith of thought and a lot higher instance of neuroticism on the left, whereas on the right, there is a very vast diversity of thought, and people tend to be very pragmatic and solutions based. So seeing a generation coming up that's a couple points towards that direction, I think to me is quite a white pill, and hopefully they're just as willing to pick up the mantle, hopefully earlier than the rest of us have in our lives. And I think that we should be the, kind of guiding light, big brother types to kind of, take them under our wing and bring them along.
Well said. Chuck, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I think one of the white pill things for me is, I think as Charlie Kirk often reminded people that the Constitution was written for religious and immoral people. I think he's quoting one of our founding fathers. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. But ultimately, I think that one of the things that's encouraging to me, given that reality, is that there has been, partly in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, but also just in general in our society. I think I kind of suspected that COVID would lead to, being trapped in your homes and all that stuff that came from the COVID lockdowns would lead people to despair. And in despair, they would look for hope, and that would lead to people turning to different types of faith. I'm a Christian, and so that's the one I hope people choose, but because I believe it to be true, not because I want more people on my team, but ultimately, one of the things that we've seen, even here in Cumberland County, is has been like an increase specifically among younger people in engaging in those types of things. And I'm not sure where it's going to lead, but I'm hopeful, and I think it's something, it's a good trend to hear, as well as like the comment about younger people, specifically I think young men, but hopefully we can make some progress among young women. Maybe the young men will convince the young women. Who knows? We'll see. But anyway, yeah, so that's something I'm very hopeful for.
Well said. And Tim, why don't you close us out with your white pill?
Let's see. As usual, I find these things hard to answer, but I had the most time to think about it too and listen to your responses. And I agree largely with everyone. And I'll piggyback off of what Dane you were saying, because talking about Gen Z being more right than previous generations. I didn't know that, but I'm super glad to hear it, of course. But I was going to say even before that that was kind of my hope that, and this is actually kind of like a black pill, white pill maybe, but as things get worse and worse in this country, with the economy, the way it's going, with inflation especially, I think it wakes more people up to, the negative effects of centralized, powerful government. At least that's my hope. So, as they get worse, I think it means it's more likely that people will be receptive to our ideas. And yeah, like you guys have all said, that we can, nurture those thoughts. I think it's a little bit of a shame that people just don't arrive at this philosophy out of the womb, that they have to actually feel the pain to want less government, but we'll take the wins we can get, right? So yeah, I think that's about it.
Well said. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. I think this was a really good conversation. It went a little bit longer than I thought it would, which is, I think, just because this is a good topic to talk about, and I think there's a lot of agreement on lots of things, which is also a positive. But before we get out of here, Chuck,
Yeah, you can check out. I mean, stuff that I'm up to is TikTok. I think TikTok is actually Muddy Waters 2024. I've got kicked off of TikTok twice. So me.
awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, guys. Before we get out of here, if you are enjoyed this content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is where we're sharing this. A little bit of real positive news, too, is that we've talked about it before, but the Libertarian Party of Maine app is in its final development stages. So hopefully we'll have some very positive news on that soon to be able to share with everybody in terms of what you can see on that app and what kind of resources we'll be able to provide. But in the meantime, best place to find information would be via Facebook on our social media, Libertarian Party of Maine, our YouTube page where you can find our Spotify, and of course our website, www.lpme.org. You'll be able to get some more information on libertarians in the state of Maine, things that we're working on, and reach out to find, get in touch with your rep, sign up to become a member of the Libertarian Party of Maine, which of course we ask that you do if you're interested. End of the day, we're a political party, so we need some help to be able to keep the lights on and keep these podcasts going. So we'll take any help that we can get, and we thank you for any donations or memberships that you guys want to give us. So on behalf of the rest of the group, if there's no more closing messages from anybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we hope you guys have a good rest of your night.
Thanks, gents.